You're listening to Rhythms of Grace, a podcast of Grace Fellowship Church in McClenny, Florida, with pastors Nathaniel Simmons and Joel Griffiths. You can find out more about Grace Fellowship Church at www.gfcbaker.org. What's up, man?
Hey, how are you?
Here we are.
We waited so long that my coffee's almost gone. Hey, I didn't know if we were going to be able to do it this week because you had jury duty yesterday. And
I did.
How'd you get out of it?
So I had jury duty like maybe 15 years ago or some way back. And I got there and I probably just missed a memo that people had already known not to show up because it was only like me and a few other people. And the judge came out and said, actually, we don't need you guys. So thanks for coming out anyway, but y'all can go home. So I didn't see like any of the process last time. But this time I did get to see more of the process. And it was very, very interesting how they go about selecting a jury and all that. So I would have been a little bit nervous, I think, to actually end up on the jury, which I didn't. So I did end up just getting to go home. But it was an educational experience for sure.
Cool.
Yeah.
I like there was a while ago, you may remember, it's like every other week I was selected for jury duty and it got canceled. So I didn't show up. And then finally one time it happened. It didn't get canceled, and I forgot about it, so I didn't show up. And I was like, sure, they were going to arrest me and throw me in jail, but they were nice about it. They just said, we'll do it next time. But no next time. I think they've lost faith in me, so they haven't asked me again since then. I do think it is cool. It's a massive inconvenience to your life, obviously, but it is. I don't know. I appreciate that we live in a country that, whether or not, regardless of how effective it is, just the heart behind, we want people to have a fair trial, and we want to, as much as we can, remove bias from a situation, from judgment.
Yeah.
And hopefully it is effective, but I think the heart behind it is even more important than the effectiveness of it, because it's sort of this sign that says, no unequal weights and measures. You do not judge people based on your affinities for them, but on the truth of the situation. And I feel like that's pretty Christian of us.
Yeah. And that the prosecution and the defense has to agree on who the jury is. Yeah.
I think all of that is the fruits of being born of, at least within a Christian worldview.
Right.
And so I'm glad we were at least established the way we were then, and not now, maybe. Ooh, that's too political. Let's not go there. Hey, I actually have another question for you. Darcy Waller and I were talking the other day about Bible translations. She has an NIV, but she's also kind of thinking, I want to get a new Bible translation. What should I get? Are there any that I should steer clear of? How should I think about picking out a new Bible? Let's not spend a whole podcast talking about it right now, but just a couple things would roll off your head. What would you say?
Well, there's a lot out there to choose from, for sure. So if you compare it to what Christians of previous generations have known, for a long time it was just the King James. That's all English speakers had to go off of. But now we live in a day where there's like a lot, and arguably probably too many English translations out there. Although we could probably debate that, I guess. But I think there's a lot of translations along the spectrum now that are good and faithful and probably serve different purposes. And so you have some that are more. We sometimes use the phrase word for word. I don't think any Bible translation really is word for word. If you really kind of get into the nuts and bolts of translation, that's just not a realistic way to think about translation. But some versions are more literal, trying to give you just exactly what the text says rather than trying to smooth it over or make it sound more like modern English. And so I think translations like the NASB is kind of sits in that category of being your more literal translation, which is
NAS,
a good
yeah, that's
NASB,
New American Standard.
Yeah, New American Standard Bible.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of another one that sits there, because really then you start moving along the spectrum of getting into more a more modern, more readable kinds of translation, which, you know, I would put the ESV in there, which is what we typically preach from. It's what I've used and read from for years. It's kind of been my standard Bible for a long time. But then also the Holman or the CSB, which you really like a lot, is kind of in that same category. And then you get to like an NIV, which is pretty modernized and easy to read. And then even from there, you've got like the NLT, which is maybe even more readable. And I haven't done like side-by-side comparisons of all these to see kind of how I feel about their readability or anything like that. But I think mainly you're probably judging them in terms of readability instead of like faithfulness, because I think all of those that I mentioned are faithful. Some are a little bit more literal. Others are a little bit more smoothed over, easy to read. But I think all of them I would classify as faithful. And so it's really just kind of picking which category along that spectrum you feel most at home with or comfortable with, I think is what it comes down to. But what do you think?
I agree. I think of it kind of like a car, like when you're shopping for cars, that there are differences between Ford and Chevy and Toyota and Honda. But if you get a major brand, like they're all going to be roughly similar, right? There's going to be if some dude built a car in his garage and you never heard of him before, maybe don't get that one. But if you get a major brand, there's a predictability behind it.
That's good.
I do. You mentioned there being so many versions. One of the reasons, I hope this doesn't sound too cynical. I don't think it's cynical, but one of the reasons we have so many is simply because there is an incentive financially for each publishing company to have their own translation. So if I want to write Crossway, they publish the ESV. So every time an author who writes for Crossway quotes a Bible verse, if they cite a new Bible translation, they would have to pay royalties. The same thing would be true of Sunday school material. If you write chunks of that off of your other Bible translations, there's some small amount of money that would go to these other Bible translations. That wouldn't apply to the King James because it's so old that it's not under the same copyright laws. But any modern translation, you would have to do that. So for a publishing company, if they want to publish tons of books and commentaries and Sunday school materials and stuff like that, and they want to save a little bit of money, it's in their best interest to have a reliable, well-approved, everybody's going to be okay with this Bible translation that would free them from having to pay royalties to another Bible translation that's still modern. And so that's one of the reasons why you have that. So giant publishing houses like Holman, like Crossway, like Zondervan, they're going to have a incentive to have a Bible translation that they can do. All their books can use that without paying money. So that's part of why it is, but why they exist, and I think that's part of why they're all going to be really reliable on the whole, is because all of these authors don't want everybody to look down their nose when they quote their. If I quote the ESV, I don't want all these Christians to say, well, that's not a legitimate translation, and therefore my whole book is undercut by me using a stupid translation. So it's actually a nice check and balance, but it is part of the reason you have a bunch of translations. But if you get a major translation, it's good. I do agree with you that there is, within the brands, there is a leaning toward a more literal but also harder to read, and a more thought for thought, easier to read but you may not have some of the clarity of repeated words being drawn out, or sometimes odd phrasing that could be significant, but it won't be as evident to you.
Yeah. So NASB, ESV, CSB, King James and New King James,
Yeah.
NIV, NLT. And I'll say about the King James, like, if you're somebody that likes that, go with it, read it. And there's nothing like, just because we generally use more modern translations today in our own context doesn't mean we have something against the King James. And I will say with the King James, you do have to be careful. I think anybody has to be careful with the older English, even though there's a literary beauty to it, and I think a lot of people love that and are drawn to that, and I am too. I like it, but a lot of times you can sometimes think you know what words or phrases mean, and you end up not actually knowing what they meant in that earlier context, and so
Right.
there's a little bit of a barrier sometimes in that way.
Right. For instance, the Lord's coming back to judge the quick and the dead.
Yeah.
That might be a little bit more obvious to people if you've grown up around
The
that
living.
phrase. But quick does not mean actually like people who are quick in this
Right.
running sense, but
Right.
they're living.
One that's less obvious is, I forget the exact wording of the verse, but let your conversation be, holy and pleasing in God's sight, or something to that effect. Your conversation, you might naturally think that means, the way you speak, the way you interact with people, but it actually means your lifestyle as
Right.
a whole. And there's just a lot of examples like that where you might think you know what a word means, but knowing what it meant in that earlier context is,
You
is
might
something
get
different.
it if you have an old pair of Converse. You know that Converse isn't talking about the way you talk; it's the way you walk, right? But how many of us are gonna like, oh, conversation is probably being used in the same way the sneakers are being used? Not many of us. Our minds won't go that way.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, good point.
Is that why they're called Converse
I think
shoes?
so. I think Converse in Latin means to walk with, or
That makes
the way
sense.
you walk. And
I never made that connection.
but I don't think any who would, right? I don't think normal people do, because we normally use Converse as the way we talk. But
Yeah.
but I think anyway, whatever.
One other thing on Bible translation. So another thing I like about the ESV, I think you've said this before too, is that it's published by Crossway, and Crossway does a lot of creative things with different Bible versions and stuff.
Yeah.
And one of the things they do is they put out readers editions of the Bible. And here's one that a friend gave to me years ago. It just looks like this, but it's the pages are kind of more, I guess they're still like thin, your typical thin Bible pages. But if you look at the text, let me find a better example. If you look at the text, it's all one column, and there's actually no verse references in it. So it actually reads more like it's just
Normal
more of a
book.
standard book reading experience. And I find that reading like that makes me more likely to, more likely to read more and read longer, because it feels less like I'm reading something to be like dissected and studied, and more like something to just be read in a more, natural kind of feeling way. And so that's not for everybody, but for somebody like me, I really enjoy that, and I think it's worth giving a try and seeing how you think about that reading experience, because the Bible originally wouldn't have been read with, verse numbers all in it and footnote letters all in it and notes and stuff like that. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I think that those are good aids when you're studying, and especially going to church, and listening to a sermon. You wouldn't take a Bible like what I just showed you, because when the pastor talks about verse 22 or whatever, you're not going to know where verse 22 is. So it's good to take a more of a studying version of the Bible to places like that and to Bible studies. But in your personal devotions, quiet time, reading times, I think it's worth trying out something like what I just showed you.
Yeah,
I like it a lot.
That is why we chose the ESV. So neither one of us believe that there is a right translation, right? So, and I don't even think it's possible to say this is the best translation, because translation just doesn't work that way. That there's going to be a newly inspired English thing. It's always about capturing the original language. It was inspired there. So anyway, if there's not a best, then why pick any one of them? And we kind of wrestled, do we even pick a translation for us to use? And we felt like it was helpful because a lot of people like to be able to follow along, and I know what my preacher is going to be preaching out of, and so I can have a Bible that matches that. It makes it easier to follow in sermons and things like that. And so we picked the Crossway ESV because we believe it's good, reliable, very, very trustworthy translation. And all what you just mentioned, it has great study Bibles. It has several good study Bibles. It has some journaling Bibles that some people have mentioned that they really like. And then it has those reader's editions that are really good. And it also has a handful of kid Bibles that are really nice. And so just the breadth of the publishing that they have, and the kind of, it's not just the Bible, but it's the formatting of the Bible, the way that well, they also had this, they call it the Legacy Bible, where they match the words on both sides of the page, so there's no bleed through, and it's made easier on your eyes.
Yeah.
So they just have some publishing things that are, I think, kind of helpful, and that gave me the nod toward that, even though I'm happy to say that there are plenty of other translations that are just as good.
Right. Another one we've been forgetting about this whole time was the Action Bible.
Is that not actually the Action Bible? Oh, the comic book Bible.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah. That's
I think it's kind of cool. I know it's not as I'm joking, obviously, but I think it's a cool.
Do you have it
way
you?
for kids to at least experience the Bible stories? I don't even. Do they even use like an actual translation in it, or is it all just kind of re-paraphrased language?
It's re-paraphrased, and it's not everything, and it's like stories, so you're not getting like all the Psalms and things like that. But it's I think it's a fun way to learn the stories of the Bible for kids.
For sure, I would have loved that as a kid. I mean, I had my own versions of things like that as a kid, but they weren't quite that cool.
Yeah, yeah. It's just, you can look it up. Action Bible. I have a copy downstairs for our girls, but I'm not going to run down and get it now.
Yeah.
But all right, that's a long time on Bible. I thought we were going to spend 5 minutes. It's longer, but let's jump into what we actually are here to do, and that's to talk about your sermon.
To put me on the hot seat.
Put you on the hot seat. I will tell you, I'm a little bit intimidated by this because I went back and listened to the last one that we did together, and I was impressed with how good you are at moderating a discussion. I'm just not sure I'm going to do as good, but I'll do my best. You did a great job. You began...
Well, you're better at answering questions than me, so we're both kind of in the uncomfortable
Well, we'll see.
spot.
We'll see. I don't know. I don't know that I agree, but anyway, we'll roll with it. Well, you started your sermon with a review. I will say that it made me think a little bit, and this is just off the side of my mind, is that there is something unique about our church. Not that we're the only church in the world that does this, but it's not necessarily easy to be a first-time visitor, right? And there are first-time visitors who come to our church. We had some this week that came to our church, and there is a sense in which you're jumping into the middle of a conversation, right? That it's not each sermon doesn't entirely stand on its own, which is one reason why you shouldn't miss very often, because you lose sight of the ongoing conversation. But because of that, you did try to bring people up to speed. You did some review, and you went in and talked about how, I think you framed it, tell me if I'm missing anything, but mostly you said Absalom is now in a situation, Absalom being the son of David, who has usurped David, taken the throne, he's put David on the run, he's left the kingdom, and now Absalom has kind of gotten into Jerusalem, he's gotten set up, but he still has this one big issue that's hanging. He's got to figure out, what am I going to do about my dad? I can't leave him like on the run. He can somehow mount up a army and come back and get me. So
Mm-hmm.
how am I going to iron out this last little piece of my plan? And so he calls in Ahithophel, and Ahithophel gives his advice, and that's, let's do a quick targeted strike. We'll get rid of David by only killing David. It'll be
Yeah.
a very targeted mission. And then Hushai comes in, and Hushai is a guy who is loyal to David, but is a counselor to Absalom. He's kind of a double agent there. And Hushai says, no, you should go big, go home, do a huge strike, and see how many people you could kill in David's army, and show everybody how strong you really are. And as you were reviewing that, you kind of made a point that you said, hey, in reality, the text says Ahithophel's plan was better, right?
Yeah,
that
yeah.
God used Hushai's plan to bring evil, basically to bring harm on Absalom. Had he gone with Ahithophel's plan, perhaps things would have worked differently, but it seemed like the wiser plan. And you just made a point in there. It's one of your small group questions, but it's in the sermon. It felt like just a passing idea, that it's a reminder to you that not all new ideas are better than the old ideas.
Right. Yeah.
And I just wanted to ask you about that. I get you framed it a little bit about. I think you said the new generation isn't
Yeah.
always wiser than the old generation.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that it's clear that Hushai is younger than Ahithophel, but I still thought it was a good point. I just want to let you kind of throw in how that came into your mind.
Even as you were talking about it, I thought about C.S. Lewis's famous passage, or he probably talks about it in multiple places, but about what he calls chronological snobbery,
Yeah.
where you can look to things that are new as being inherently better as things that are old. And it seems to me like every generation has this tendency or this temptation to want to go with what's new rather than what's old. I mean, right down to the level of you see it in teenagers who want to rebel against their parents because what do my parents know? And then you see that a lot of times on a larger cultural level too. Everybody wants to do away with the wisdom of the past. And you're right, it's not so much about the age of Ahithophel versus Hushai, but it's just, and I'll admit that I could be stretching the text a little bit to take it in this way, but it was just something that was striking to me, that Absalom just seemed to have no regard for Ahithophel, despite the fact that Ahithophel was so reliable and so just revered for his wisdom and his advice. Like his word was treated like the word of God. The text says at one point, and but the fact that Absalom just says, no, we're not going to go with you. We're going to go with Hushai, which like 2 minutes ago, Absalom was kind of suspicious and questioning Hushai about the fact that he had joined up with their team. And
Right.
So, I don't know, you just see this. And you mentioned how Absalom's pride probably played a role in saying, yeah, I like this plan because that means a lot of attention for me and a lot of glory for me by dominating in such a big way. And so I think that played a role in it too. But yeah, I mean, I just thought it would be a good topic of conversation about how do we do this sometimes? How do we see this play out in our culture that we want to go with what's new and progressive, to use kind of a politically charged term, but rather than what is old, rather than listening to voices of the past. And I wanted to be clear too, to say it's not that any generation is perfect. I don't think that's the point I would want to say at all. It's not as if older is always better. So like Lewis's chronological snobbery can work both directions. You can look at what's old as being inherently better than what's new. So anything that's new is just bad automatically. And I don't think that's the right attitude to have either. But I do believe in multiple ways, in different places, the Bible teaches us to honor those who came before, honor the wisdom of a previous generation, listen to those who are older and have more experience than you, let it be your disposition to do that. And I think that wasn't Absalom's disposition at all. I forget who it is. I should have looked this up ahead of time, but there was another character in, I believe it's in Samuel, one of the Samuels, who only listened to people who were his own age rather than the people who were older than him, and that led to bad things in that circumstance too. I should look that up, but anyway, that's just some of my thoughts on it.
There's probably a pretty strong connection between pride and listening to new things. It reminds me of an illustration. You're going to have to tell me where this came from, because I always credit you because you're the one that said it, but I know you didn't come up with it. But there's a man who buys a property, and he goes out and he sees this fence in his property, and he's like, well, I don't want this fence. So
Chesterton.
So he's like, I'm going to tear it down. I'm going to build what I want. And he says, there's another guy who says, well, before I tear this down, I should go ask why the fence was put up in the first place, that maybe there's a reason for it. And if I had the knowledge of why the fence was there, then I can make a wise decision of what to do. Yeah. And
that's from Chesterton. And I like the way Chesterton says it. He says, there's a guy who wants to tear a fence down because he doesn't see the use of it. And he's like, well, you can't tear it down until you see the use of it, making the point that you need to see what it was there for in the first place before you, and then only then are you allowed to tear it down.
That's way better said than I did. But
in Chesterton's way,
Yeah, well, you have, in my mind and in my heart, you've commandeered it. It's your quote now. But I think that kind of fits along with what you're saying, is just because it's new or you don't understand it, you don't just, you want to go and really understand the logic.
Right.
And to not do that is kind of an arrogance in you.
Well, jury duty, to go back to that, we were having a conversation the other day because me and just kind of my flippant way, I threw out that I really kind of thought the whole idea of a jury is sort of weird. Like you just grab 12 random people off the street and let them make a decision about somebody's fate. And so in my sort of initial thinking about something, I'm like, what is this? This seems crazy. But then you talked through it with me a little bit, and I'm like, I do see some good reasons for that now. So yeah.
I'm a fan of jury duty, even though I'm a fan of other people having jury duty.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the concept. I don't want to be a part of it.
All right, so that was kind of your introduction. You were just getting us back on stage, and I just thought that was an interesting point you made. Yeah. But really, when you begin in verse 15 and you start rolling through this initial scene, and in the initial scene you have a slew of characters that are part of this plot to how are we going to get the information that Hushai hears back to David's ears, right? So they got to take that information to him. There's two key players that are the sons of Zadok and Abiathar, and they're supposed to go tell them, but those guys, Jonathan and Ahimaaz, or however you say his name, they're too well known, and so they gotta hide out because it would be suspicious. So they basically hide out. A female servant who is unknown becomes a key player, and then this guy we don't even know, he owns a well out there in Bahurim, and he becomes a key player. And this kind of raised up for you. You can tell me if I'm skipping anything in first, but it raised up for you the interesting idea that the most important characters in this story, at least at this point, are unknown to us, right?
Don't know their name, don't really know anything about them other than what they did on this occasion and in this story.
All right, and you had a George Eliot quote, which I started to write down, and I couldn't write fast enough, but it was beautiful. You want to share that?
Yep. And by the way, and I mentioned this in the message, I didn't know this until I looked it up, but George Eliot was a pen name of a woman whose real name I'm forgetting now is Mary Evans, I think, Mary Ann Evans. But anyway, she wrote under the pen name George Eliot. And I don't actually know the context of this quote. It may have been just something somebody said in a novel or something like that. But it is a pretty striking quote, and it says, "The growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts." And I would actually, if I were to kind of edit this and make it more something I agree with, I guess, I would probably say is largely dependent on unhistoric acts. But she goes on and says, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been. In other words, the reason things are good for us today are that, she says, is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. So you live faithfully a hidden life, and in the end, you rest in an unvisited tomb. I mean, how many graves are there when you walk around in a graveyard that nobody visits anymore? And you read all these names and when they lived, and you wonder what their stories were, and we don't know, but they had stories and they lived their lives a certain way. And I just think it's a profound thing to reflect on, that in so many ways, the way the world is now is determined by people who lived hidden lives. And I think that is applicable. I don't know that this statement is trying to make a statement particularly toward the Christian life and believers, but I think that's very applicable to our lives as believers, that we shouldn't be concerned with, if my life is not, if I'm not out front, if I'm not famous or popular and people see the things I'm doing, then my life's really not worth much. We shouldn't think that way. Your life is valuable, and even if nobody ever remembers your name after you die, your life is valuable, and the way that you live is valuable and will have a ripple effect for years and years to come. And so regardless of what kind of life you have, regardless of how famous you are or whatever, just live faithfully a hidden life and be content to rest in a tomb one day that is unvisited, that people walk by and just say, I wonder who that was, because God sees and knows all, and ultimately everything we do is for Him and for His glory, and He uses it all for His glory. And so I think these unnamed people in this story give us an opportunity to reflect on things like that.
Yeah. My brother-in-law, Andrew, has said for years that he wants to write a book titled Excelling at Mediocrity. And I love it. I love the title. Both of us were involved in Campus Crusade at roughly, I'm about 3 years older than him. So roughly the same era at two different schools. I was at Virginia Tech. He's at James Madison. And we talked about how in college there was this huge push to leaving your legacy and what's the legacy of your life and who wants to live a life that doesn't mean anything and what are you going to have to show for your life at the end of your life. And we were always like, man, nothing. Like really at the end of my life I'll probably be forgotten and no big deal. And my legacy is going to be relatively insignificant. And I felt like my college experience would have said, well, that's a wasted life. And I really want to push back on that, and I think you're doing a good job of pushing back on that. My view of what is a legacy and what God is asking for me can be quite different. And I think I would be better served to ask, have I lived a faithful life, than how much have I accumulated or what impact have I made? And I don't want to be like anti-impact. It's not that God may call me to make big impact or small impact, but the bigger question is faithfulness, not legacy.
Yeah.
I like that you asked, would you be content to live a simple, unknown, but obedient life?
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that point. Do you struggle with that? Or has that been, you're kind of a little bit more of an introvert than I am. A little bit. Like you just seem like you you've always struck me as a very chill personality. Like, has that been just like an easy thing for you, or is that kind of like,
Yeah, I mean, like anybody, I mean, I'll see people who are doing bigger things than me, you know, preachers who have a bigger platform and speak at conferences, or even guys who have, you know, bigger YouTube channels than me, or stuff like that. And I'll want that, you know, and I'll have a kind of envy for that. And so even if it's my personality to be more quiet and reserved, and in some ways, like I like the idea, and I'm drawn to living a quiet life. I still have envy just like anybody else would, and I don't think anybody is immune from that. So,
well, that makes me feel better. I don't want to be the only one that point applied to. Moving on, you did mention that this woman lies, like doesn't. So last week we talked about Hushai being deceptive, right? So it wasn't that he like out and out lied, but he told the truth in a way that was unclear. And if you tell the truth in a way that's unclear, then it's kind of a lie, right? Well,
yeah.
Now it's just a straight up lie. Hey, they're gone, and they weren't gone. They're hiding in a tomb. And what do you think about that? You want to? We've talked about it some, so you don't have to
hiding
go into
in a well,
tons
not a tomb. But.
Oh yeah. Well, this has been happening to me a lot recently, where I think I say one thing and I've actually said another, and my girls are good at picking it up. But
I'll graciously correct you.
I guess my brain is just it's really starting.
We were just
to feel
talking
my
about
age.
tombs, so
Yeah.
That would have been scarier though, hiding in a tomb.
Yep. Anyway, they're hiding in a well. I don't know. Hiding in a well seems pretty scary to me. But give me a quick rundown of, is it right to lie?
Yeah. It's a good question, and one that I think it's, and we talked about this a week or two ago on the podcast, that it's a good thing that Christians wrestle with this kind of question, because we are people who love the truth and are committed to the truth. And so, but the question is, are there ever times where you need to say something, or even do something? I think our actions can accomplish this too, of being deceptive, of saying something that is not true. In a sense, even just hiding somebody is a deceptive kind of act, because you want other people to think they're not there. But the particular instance of actually lying, actually speaking words that are untrue, it seems like we have more of a question about and are more concerned about. And I get it. I think for me, as I read passages like this one, where this woman leads the bad guys a different direction and says, yeah, they went the other way. They went across the river. I think the plainest way to read passages like this is that those people were doing the right thing. I just don't get the sense at all that as we read it, we're supposed to think, yeah, they really messed up here. They really sinned, but God used it for good anyway. God can use sin ultimately for good. Like I understand that. But in my opinion, I think that the most natural way to read these is not that they were doing something wrong, but they actually did what they were supposed to do. They did the right thing in these instances, and it was a courageous thing to do. Yeah. I did mention Wayne Grudem, which I see you've got his politics book behind you.
Yeah.
But and here's his ethics book, and he doesn't know how to write a book under 1,000 pages, so everything he writes is really big. But here's his ethics book, which is just a big book about what's right and what's wrong, and how we figure that out in a host of different ways. But he argues that he takes the view that it is never okay, it's never right to lie. But if you dig into some of the caveats he puts on that, and the nuance that he puts on it, he does say that sometimes maybe you can speak deceptively in a way that misleads and not be guilty of lying necessarily. And in my opinion, I don't see much of a difference between that. So, for example, one of the examples he gives is what you mentioned about Hushai coming to Absalom and saying, "I will be your servant." Grudem says, well, maybe that wasn't a lie because Hushai was a servant. He was just a bad and unfaithful servant. And as I read that, I think, okay, well, but if we can do that, if we can kind of play with language and play with our words in that way, like, it seems to me there's no end to the way in which you can do that. So when the Nazis come to your door and they're like, you know, are you hiding Jews here, or where are the Jews? You can say, they're not here. And what does here mean? Like, does here mean 5 feet around us in our immediate vicinity, or does here mean, you know, in my house? And so I think if you're allowed to kind of play with language a little bit,
they're
and the way Grudem
here.
Yeah, they're not they're not right here. Or who's they even? Like, who gets to say what they refers to? When I say they are not here, maybe I'm talking about some completely other different group of people.
The Beatles.
That's totally a convention of conversation. It seems, to when somebody asks you a question and you say, you know, about a group of people, and you say they, it's just assumed that you're talking about the same group of people. So I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm taking it to more of an absurd level than Grudem intends, but the point is that I think the plainest way to read these passages is that, yes, these people did lie, they did speak something that wasn't true, but it is looked at as the right thing to do. You can look at other examples too in the Bible, like the Hebrew midwives who didn't kill the Jewish boys, and Rahab doing a similar thing to what this woman does here in hiding spies. These people are celebrated for what they did, and how God used them and their courage. And so, and if you want another opinion, another guy who writes giant books is John Frame, and he takes the view that I basically take, that it's okay to lie in some rare instances in which, and usually the case is something along the lines of protecting innocent life or protecting people who are being wrongly treated. Anyway, that's a long answer. What do you think?
Actually, I thought you nailed it. The last week when we talked about it, I read from Corrie ten Boom, and you know, her sister said we can never lie, and she told the truth. She said they're under the table when they're really under the floor, under the table, and God provided in that. But Corrie ten Boom said, I don't really think that got us off the hook, because we still wore costumes, we still we did things to try to make it look like there were no Jews here. So we weren't living with the truth exposed. That we weren't trying to be ruthlessly honest in all things. Mm-hmm. We were hoping to hit the bare minimum requirement of honesty in order to keep the truth concealed, right? And so I don't really believe, in her mind, she's like, I don't really think that answered the question at the end of the day. And I agree with her, that there is a time in which she recognized telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth was not her obligation because of the rest of the context that was around her. And I find it hard that the question for me, another famous guy is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who makes a plot to kill Hitler and is unsuccessful. And he says, well, I think it's wrong to kill. I also think it was wrong not to kill Hitler. Because Hitler was killing 6 million Jews. And he's like, I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm caught in between two sins, to become party to Hitler and to serve a maniac, or to seek to end his reign by ending his life. And he chose to basically make an attempt to kill Hitler. It was unsuccessful, and that's another story. But Bonhoeffer's position was that I'm in such a situation that everything I do is sin. And my only thing I can do is make my best attempt to do what I think pleases the Lord and repent of the sin that I do, and the sin that's in my heart and ask God to reward the faith that's there at the same time. And I've always appreciated the humility of his heart in that situation. However,
and the struggle is good.
Yeah. However, I don't know that I'm convinced that actually everything is sin. Like, I think the act of faith that he was doing, I'm not sure. I just don't know. But at the end of the day, I think that he was justified in what he did. I think he did it in faith. Luther famously says, if you're going to sin, sin boldly, or sin in faith. And what he means by that is not like, hey, you should sin more often. But he says that if you act in faith, believing that you're doing right before God, then that is not sin. Where if you do the right thing, but you think it's sin, then it is sin. That God is judging the motives of your heart. And that can be an excuse for you to say, I can do whatever I want as long as my heart is right. But at the end of the day, I do think he's right that your heart does matter. And seeking to save a person's life, seeking to honor God in this way is, I'm happy to say, do what you do in faith, trusting that you're pleasing the Lord, and trust him to honor the acts of faith like he does for this young lady here. So anyway, I don't know. I think we've hit that.
I think even if I'm in that position of, having to lie like this woman did, I think even in doing it, and even in feeling that I was right and justified in doing it, there would be a sense in which it feels kind of weird. It feels kind of like I'm not used to doing that, and that's a good thing that you're not used to doing that because these are exceptional circumstances. But
there's an honor in being a bad liar. I'm not very practiced at it.
I don't even like. So you've probably played the game Mafia, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like a social deduction game. You're trying to figure out who the bad guy is, and you have to. I mean, the name of the game is, the whole game is built around lying. Like you just have to lie, and like we do that in a game context, and I think that's fun. Some people are still like, no, this is a whole game about lying. Like this is wrong,
right?
And or even in the situation of like throwing a surprise party for somebody, which often means you have to lie to them about where they're going or what they're doing or something. Like there's a part of me that like just doesn't like that. I don't like looking somebody in the face and telling them something that's not true, even if it's for a fun purpose like that, for the purpose of ultimately like being a blessing to them. There's just something kind of icky feeling about saying something that's not true. And I think that's good. I think that we have that. I think it's good that we have that tendency in our heart.
I totally agree. All right, let's keep on moving. We're in verse 23. You pushed on through and said, let's hop to 23. And that's when Ahithophel sees his counsel is not followed. Jesse said you should have titled the sermon, The Unreasonable Response to His Friends Not Listening to Him, which I loved. I love that. I think that got a chuckle from everybody. It is crazy that he doesn't even know what's going to happen yet. It's just his advice wasn't followed, and so he goes and he kills himself.
Like he's that good, like he's that smart, he's that seasoned.
Great point.
That he sees exactly where this is headed.
Yeah. So why? I mean,
why does he do it?
That's the answer. So I was going to ask that. Why does he do it? But you think maybe he's smart, right?
Right. Yeah. I think that is where I went in the message anyway, and I think you have maybe a different something else to add to the conversation.
Yeah, I would agree that he sees the writing on the wall.
But I'll go through kind of the few things that I went through in the sermon. Number one was that people have said maybe it's just a pride thing for him, that he was so his pride was so wounded, he was so humiliated and embarrassed by his advice not being taken, that he just kind of didn't have the will to live anymore. I think his pride probably was wounded, but that seems like a pretty dramatic reason to take your own life. And so
especially
for me,
for a person who's otherwise wise.
Yeah.
in other ways, he seems to be in total control and so that seems like
Right.
a loss.
Yeah,
of
he's a
control.
reasonable man. He's logical. But another idea that people put out about this that may kind of tie in is that he's Ahithophel. I mean, Ahithophel is Bathsheba's grandfather.
Yeah.
So Bathsheba is his granddaughter, and so when you can kind of pretty easily speculate that there were some bad feelings from Ahithophel toward David over that, and that this was something that he had still not gotten over and not forgiven David for, the way that David sinned with Bathsheba and kind of turned her life upside down. And it's easy to think that Ahithophel had this desire for revenge against David, that as bitterness and resentment does so oftentimes, it just builds and builds and builds and makes someone miserable, really, with this desire to get back at somebody. And whenever that is kind of taken from him, like he had this one chance, this great plan that would have worked probably if they had gone with it, to take out David, and then it was passed over in favor of some other guy, and again, as I think he does see the writing on the wall and thinks this isn't going to go well, like that whole reason he had for living, perhaps, and his bitterness and resentment is taken from him, and he just wants to die at that point. I think that's probably a layer of Ahithophel and his emotions too in this moment. But I do think, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say several commentaries, and then I know Alistair Begg made a big deal about framing all of Ahithophel's actions as a response to the sin against his granddaughter Bathsheba. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I have not gone that way, and I haven't emphasized it in the sermon because it feels to me that the text never makes that explicit. It feels like I'm reading between the lines a lot, and I wouldn't go so far as to say it couldn't be right. But I'm not sure that I feel convinced. And to be frank, like the way I've seen women treated here, I mean, Absalom was willing to kill people over what happened to his sister. But you have other places where it's like, here, just take this woman to be your wife because she's collateral. Like, I don't know Ahithophel's view of Bathsheba. And I just don't know. And so I was hesitant to put as much weight in that point.
I get it.
Anyway, keep going. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I think, so for me, the most satisfactory answer and convincing answer is that Ahithophel just saw the writing on the wall. He knew where this was going because, again, he's an expert. He knows what he's talking about. He knows, probably knows how these plans are going to play themselves out, and can see that David is probably going to survive this, and not only that, but end up taking the throne back, and that won't mean good things for Ahithophel, probably. And so instead of kind of dying in a inglorious, humiliating kind of way, Ahithophel is going to take matters into his own hands, be the master of his own fate, and he's going to set his house in order, make it as easy as possible for himself, and he's just going to go ahead and check out early. So that was kind of the view I took of it. But you have something else to add, so why don't you do that?
So I have an idea, but this is something I'm not convinced of. I was talking the other day with somebody about how you can believe things, but within that belief, there's how certain are you that you're right? I'm not certain that I'm right, but it's a guess that I have. I think Ahithophel views himself as a good guy, right? And all along, he sees David getting old and David's kingdom crumbling. David's not done a good job with his sons, and he sees everything going bad, and possibly even he doesn't like the idea of giving the kingdom to Solomon. This is something I've read before, that is the idea that Solomon is going to be in line, right? Is that already known? And maybe he's like, no, this guy, Absalom, should be the king, and he is trying to bring about a transfer of power from David to his son, who could be a good, strong ruler and help the country and keep the country strong. And I think that he views himself as a patriot in what he's doing. Yeah, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, right? So, like, I wish I didn't do it this way, but I'm going to. So then what he does is like, all right, here's what we'll do. We'll keep the country from ever going into war. Nobody will have to die except for David. I don't even know if he really thought he would kill David or get him out of the way in some way, but he's going to enact this. He's going to bring about the kingdom of David's sons for David by bringing David's son up into the throne. And then he says, all right, here's the plan to do it. It's going to be perfect. And this guy's put his hopes in. It's like, no, I'm actually going to do civil war, and we'll see how many people I can kill, and everybody will see how strong I am. And then if he's like, oh, I've just given the kingdom to a monster, right? Like basically what I've done.
Yeah.
I thought I was serving the kingdom.
Yeah.
What I was really doing is opposing the king. So I was taking up counsel against the Lord's anointed to set up the wrong guy. And he realizes, like, what I've convinced myself all along is that I'm a helper, when in reality, because I wasn't following the will of God, I was a traitor. And so this is a kind of repentance in that it's an admission of guilt, right? It's like I was on the wrong side. But it's not true repentance, because true repentance doesn't end in suicide. It ends in actual repentance. But it's an admission of guilt. And so that's a narrative that I have in my head as a possibility. To collaborate, another narrative I have in my head, and this actually is going to somewhere you go in your sermon, is I also view that as something that could have been happening in Judas's head.
Yeah.
So why does Judas betray Jesus? Well, Judas believes, possibly, that Jesus is the king who's going to take over. He's going to make Israel get out of Roman occupation, and the king is going to prove himself strong. And so Judas thinks, I'm forcing Jesus' hand here. Yeah, I'm making a pretty penny on the deal, but maybe doesn't even understand the depths of his betrayal. He thinks Jesus is poised to become the next king. I mean, just a week ago, everybody was saying he's the king of David and putting palm branches on the ground. I think that I can pull this off and force Jesus to take the throne that's rightfully his. And then all of a sudden he shows up and everybody says, crucify him. And he's like, oh, that's not what I thought was going to happen. And so he goes and hangs himself. And I wonder if the suicide of Judas and Ahithophel, also, they both are parallel in the idea that they thought they were doing good in their own wisdom and in their own plan. But what really happened is that they proved to themselves that they were traitors because they didn't trust the king to be the king. They thought that they had to kind of rule for him or through him. And so I don't know. I see it as a possibility.
No, I think that's compelling. And even just hearing you talk about it more, that especially with that comparison to Judas, I think that very well could be part of what Ahithophel's going through too, a kind of repentance, an admission of guilt, and I'm on the wrong side here, and I guess humiliation at that fact that I've messed up extremely here. And so
that could explain why when he does commit suicide, it's still framed in the text as a kind of honorable thing. Then he gets buried in the tomb of his father, and he's not entirely shamed. Absalom will be shamed much more than Ahithophel will be, but I don't know.
Hanging by a tree with his hair.
Yeah. And so anyway, I don't know. I admit that it's speculative, but I see it as reasonable. Now,
well, I think you kind of have to do that a lot, really, just to be frank, with Bible stories like this, where you're not given full details and a full look into people's hearts and their motives. Like a lot of times, trying to judge why it is people are doing things, if it's not explicitly stated, like the only thing we're really left with is doing a little bit of speculation. And I think I don't think there's anything wrong with that personally.
If that's the case, then you can see parallels of that kind of thinking in other places in the Bible. So God promises, we talked last night, God promises Abraham, I'm going to give you a son. And Abraham gets old, 99 years old, and it hasn't happened yet. And he's like, all right, God, I do believe you're going to bring me a son, but you're not going to be able to make it happen. So I'm going to make it happen for you. And so he takes Hagar. And God says, nope, I'm going to do it my way. And there's judgment for that. I think it doesn't go fully as bad, but Peter is like, oh, nobody's going to betray you. I'm going to kill everybody. And he's like, put away your sword. Like you cannot take the kingdom of God in your way. It has to happen in God's way. And I think that part of trusting God is not only that God has the right ends in mind, but he has the right means to accomplish those ends. And that you have to, the sin of Ahithophel, if I'm right, is not what he wanted to accomplish, but that he thought that he could outplot God's anointed king in order to accomplish it his way. Now, regardless of whether I'm right or not, what I think is absolutely clear, and you make this point in your sermon really well, is that there is clearly a connection between Ahithophel and Judas, right? They're both traitors. You mentioned they both plot against the king, and they both commit suicide in a similar way. And I thought that brought you to a really interesting point that you made when you reflected on Jesus announcing that somebody at that table was going to be the betrayer, right? This night, somebody's going to hand me over. They're going to betray me. And you said, had you been at that table, or most of us been at that table, we would have probably been like, who is it? Is it him? Is it him? Is it him? And you thought how compelling it was to you that people said, actually, no, ask, is it me? Will I be the one? Right. And you saw that as, I think I'm correct. I'm representing you correctly. You saw that as a compelling invitation for us to see the betrayal of Judas and of Ahithophel as a question, will I betray him?
Right, yeah.
Why don't you expand
Because, I mean, everybody looks at Judas as an obvious bad guy. And I mean, he is in the end. But I think a better way to respond to Judas is to examine ourselves in light of him and to ask the question, am I capable of that? Because I think too many people probably have this idea that, oh, they would never do that. And I think when you take that kind of idea, you're a lot like Peter, who basically said that to Jesus. I'll never deny you, Lord. And Jesus said, yeah, you will, before the rooster crows. Like, you will deny me. And Peter experienced that and saw, yep, Jesus is exactly right. And I am a lot more cowardly and than I thought I was, and less committed to Christ than I thought I was. And he wept bitterly. He didn't kill himself, thankfully, but he wept bitter tears of repentance and shame. Right. When it came out that, my heart is more prone to wander than I really thought. And I think that's just something for every one of us to be real with ourselves about and say, look, I don't know my heart. And like Paul says, let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. That should be our disposition to say, I am desperately in need of God and his sustaining grace every moment of every day. And we should feel the weight and the sobering reality of the fact that every one of us has a Judas inside of us, in a sense, or an Ahithophel inside of us, that to be a traitor to the true King. And I just wanted to encourage self-examination in that regard.
Yeah,
and humility.
I really like that. Something that I feel that we don't do as good as, at least my impression of previous generations, is praying that God will sustain us, keep us in the faith. There's a doctrine of the perseverance of the saints, which it basically claims that all true believers who have been saved by God will stay in the faith because the same God that saves you will keep you. But the way they seem to apply that, when you read back through the Puritan prayers, for instance, that we read sometimes, and the Valley of the Vision, you see a lot of prayers, God hold me, God keep me. And so they're not like once saved, always saved means I prayed this prayer, now it's done. It's, God, I believe that my coming to faith brought me into your family, but I also think me staying in the faith is just as much your work, and therefore I'm going to regularly pray, God, just keep me. Don't let me become a Ahithophel. Don't let me become Judas. Don't let me become these people who follow you and then drift away. And I see that as something that you can pray in confidence that God will do that for his children, but also that's part of God's means for keeping me, is having the humility to pray regularly that he will keep me.
That's right.
That's right. All right. So the passage ends. Let's move toward verse 27 through the end of the passage with three more, I think, relatively unknown guys. So they do have names. Unlike the woman, the young lady, and the guy who owned the well, these guys are named, but they're not major players in the story of the Bible.
Right.
But they're, again, really significant. Shobi, Rabbah, maybe, of the Ammonites, Shobi, Machir, and
yeah.
Barzillai. And Barzillai, I told you earlier, I just think Godzilla. Barzillai. And you told me the backstory of the two, and you said we don't really know Godzilla's backstory.
Yeah.
I know Barzillai, but I'm going to keep calling him Godzilla for fun. The
I won't correct you.
Yeah, we can let this one go. So,
yeah, and this was something, reading commentaries, they typically would explain everything that can be said about Shobi and Machir, and usually there wasn't much said at all about Barzillai because there's just less known about him or less to draw from in terms of any kind of backstory that might have led to this display of generosity that we see here. But in Shobi's case, the first guy, he's an Ammonite, which David, if you read about David's relationship with them, he had a good relationship with Nahash, who was a king of the Ammonite. They had of Ammonites. They had a peace treaty together. But then Nahash's son Hanun took over, and then he didn't like David, and that led to conflict between them. But instead of David wiping them out completely, he ends up making peace with them again. And probably most people think David put Shobi on the throne of the Ammonites, and Shobi was like a younger brother after Hanun. And so he didn't wipe out that family completely, and he kind of gave them a fresh start, is what most people think. And so that kindness that David showed to them is coming back to David, now being returned to David. With Machir's story, that he was he's said to be a guy that Mephibosheth stayed with, and Mephibosheth is the grandson of Saul, son of Jonathan, that David again shows kindness to. And I like thinking about it from that perspective, because if Machir was kind of in the background of that whole story of David showing kindness to Mephibosheth and taking in Mephibosheth, then Machir kind of was indirectly blessed or saw that example of David and that of his kindness, and was blessed by that. And so that kindness that David showed to Mephibosheth is coming back to him now through Machir, who was indirectly affected from that kindness. And I just kind of brought out the point that sometimes you know, in showing kindness to people and living faithfully in obedience to the Lord and loving people, you bless all kinds of people really indirectly in ways you may not even see. I almost brought out the old Ray Boltz song, "Thank You, Lord." You know what song I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Where the guy gets to heaven and all these people come up to him that he doesn't know, but they say, you know, you blessed me in this way years ago, and I saw you do this or that, and that was a blessing to me.
Cannon was in the nursery, so Ray Boltz's biggest fan would have missed that illustration anyway.
Yeah, and I know he sadly kind of fell off the wagon
did
recently.
He? I didn't know that.
Yeah, just lifestyle stuff. But anyway, not getting into all that. Like,
yeah.
Obviously, that song was very popular in in the 80s and 90s, and it's got all the 80s and 90s cheesiness you would expect from a song like that. But I do think that there's a powerful point there to be made.
I am a life that was changed.
Right. But anyway, so the whole general point I make, even though I couldn't say anything about Barzillai, just not knowing what kind of backstory there may have been for him, is that these are people that are kind of out of the ordinary. They're not normal kinds of people. You know, a guy from another nation, a guy like Machir, who was probably on Team Saul back in Saul's day, you know, but they're people kind of out of the ordinary that you wouldn't normally expect, but they're people that have been blessed by David in some way through the way David has lived, and so that kindness that David has shown to other people is coming back to him in a way through all of these resources that they give, and it just goes on and on with all the things that are brought to David and to his men. Because they are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. God provides even in a place like that where it looks like nothing is going his way. God is going to make sure he's richly provided for. Psalm 23, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. It's no surprise that David wrote those words because he has experienced that kind of kindness from the Lord.
Yeah. So the enemies in this case are Gentiles, right? I mean, so they're his friends, but they're enemies. Each one of these are enemy nations, Ammonites, Lodabar. I think that is a Gentile area, right?
Yeah.
And certainly Gileadites. I wonder, and we don't have to go into this too deeply right now because there's another point to be made, but I do wonder how much of this is foreshadowing the church age when Christ rises. The Jewish people, you know, John says he came to his own and his own received him not, even at the ascension of Jesus. There is a remnant of Jews that follow him and the gospel spreads there, but on the whole, the Jewish nation did not follow their Messiah. And what does happen instead is the gospel spreads to the ends of the earth and the nations are being brought in, and we're carrying our gifts in right now. And we're, in some sense, the church is predominantly the Shobais and Machirs and Godzillas of the world. And I don't know how much of this is meant to foreshadow that, but it does seem to me that much of what is happening in these stories, especially toward the end of this book, people who are not supposed to be God's people are being called into God's service to care for the king and to follow the king who is God's king. And I don't know, it obviously has some parallel
right
to you and me who are Gentiles.
Right. And I almost made the connection to the wise men who bring gifts to Jesus. I mean, we don't know that there were three wise men, but there were three gifts given to Jesus. And, you know, it's just that idea of God's bringing people from all over who are recognizing this king. And, I think that's just a powerful picture. And it's kind of where I tried to end the sermon on a note of look at all these people, look at all these different ways that God is using different people in his kingdom. And it's all for one purpose. It's all in service to the true king, whether you're talking about what Hushai did, what the priest did, what the young servant girl did, Jonathan and Ahimaaz, the man who owned the well, the woman, the Shobi, Machir, Barzillai. And I talked about how there's so many names in this story, and it's easy to get them all confused. But when you just take a step back and look at the big picture, it's all these different people from different walks of life, all doing whatever they can in service to the true king. And I think that's a really cool picture of the church and what we're called to be as a church. We're all different. We have different stories, different backgrounds, different personalities, all these things, but it's all in service to the true king, the one true king who is Jesus. And so
I thought that was such a good point, and a point that you can almost spend another hour talking about how there is. I don't want to get into weird philosophy stuff here, but we're watching Tuttle Twins with the kids, which is like this politics cartoon to teach kids to be conservative, and I love it. And there's one episode on The Invisible Hand by Adam Smith, and he's talking about how nobody can build a pencil. That it takes guys who mine graphite, guys who make trucks, right? Guys who make get rubber to make tires for trucks, guys who are foresters and they cut down trees, guys who rubber for erasers, and all these different industries are working together, and none of these industries are all saying together we're going to come to make a pencil. There's other guys that are taking a little bit from this industry and this industry, and they're putting it all together to make a pencil. And the argument that Adam Smith makes is that nobody can make a pencil, right? Because we're all depending on some invisible hand that's guiding all of these markets to work well, so that at the end of the day, a pencil can roll out. But if I just ask any one person, go make a pencil, and you have to start from scratch, nobody can do it. Certainly, you couldn't start a pencil company. And he said it's just a really amazing thing about how the world is built on a mutual dependence of people that don't even realize how dependent they are. And I kind of feel like that's what you're saying here, is that that there's an invisible hand in this entire story that is providing for God's king through some known people, but mostly unknown people. And that if you read this story, you should walk away with two things. One is the absolute importance of all of these unknown people who are part of God's plan. But obviously, bigger than that is that all of those players are controlled by the invisible hand of God, who is orchestrating all people together for the sake of his king. Yeah. And then I think what that tells you and me for our church is that we are one of those. I mean, I doubt anybody's going to write a biography on Grace Fellowship Church in McClenny, Florida, much less any one of us or our church. Like, we're just not going to be significant in the history of the world, probably. And that's okay. But don't we believe that we're part of the invisible hand of God that is moving and shaping and doing things in this world for the sake of his king and his kingdom? And is it enough for us to be part of that vast anonymous army in service of the king? Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know what all will take place in heaven, but maybe when we're in heaven, we'll just get to somehow be able to view the entire vista of history and all that God did through all these people, and read it like a story. And in some chapter, in some paragraph of that story, there will be something written about what we did as a church and the role that we played. Yeah. I think that's a cool thing to imagine.
Yeah.
So let's just be faithful to do that, and to do all we do for the sake of the true King. That was the point I wanted to end on anyway in the sermon.
I think that's a good point to end. You got out of me asking you if you believe in karma. But actually,
that's right.
I kind of feel like this is a good place to end it, and you did a fine job. There's no point in rehashing that. You said,
no, I don't believe in karma. It's a Buddhist Hindu thing, and actually ties into the whole view of reincarnation as well, which is obviously beyond, not what we believe. And so, but I do believe in the principle taught in Proverbs that he who is a blessing will be blessed.
That's right.
He who is watered will be watered, and God is in control of how that plays itself out in our lives. It's not some mechanical thing that we can keep a record of the good we've done and then say, God, you owe me this now because I did all these things. Like, you're not in control of that. You're not in charge of that. You trust God to take care of you, and he says that he will.
Well, since we're here, then we might as well go in. I thought you did a really good job of explaining why the prosperity gospel, in one way, you're like, well, it's not a total repudiation of God blessing people who serve him, but it's a repudiation of the way it can be framed, that if you buy this prayer cloth, you will get this blessing, right?
Yeah.
And that there is a sort of correspondence of one good gift gets one good turn gets another in proportion to each other. And you're like, that's not what you're saying at all.
Yeah.
Because if it was that way, then our goodness is actually a manipulative tool in which we can steer God.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
God becomes the means to an end in
Yeah.
that instance. We got something good we want, and God is a convenient way for us to get that. And so we love God, and we're all about God insofar as He is the means to the end that we really want, which is something else, something material or whatever the case may be. And that God will just not be put in that position. He doesn't belong in that position. And to try and treat Him that way is, well, it's a bad thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought you did a great job on that. And so somehow we want to say, don't be that way, but also believe that God is good. Well, what does Hebrews 11:6 say? Faith is the belief that God is, and that He rewards those who, is it love Him or obey Him? I can't remember.
Yeah. Those who seek Him
or seek Him.
I can't remember either. Now that you say
let me pull
it
up. That He rewards those who seek
right.
Him. You got it right.
Yeah.
He rewards those who seek Him. And so
that whole idea of rewards is something that Christians can kind of feel awkward about sometimes, because I remember being in a philosophy class in college, one of the first classes I took in college, and I really, really enjoyed it. But that was where I first came across the idea of altruism, which is this idea that you should always do what is right simply because it is right, and without any thought given toward the rewards that may come or the good that may come to you as a result of doing what is right. And like, I remember feeling, oh, maybe that is kind of the right way to view the world and the right way to view my actions and my motivations. And but as I kind of dwelled on it more, and really as I kind of read the Bible more, it was like I knew I couldn't accept this idea that I was supposed to think only in terms of what is right without any thought to what rewards are, because Jesus over and over again appeals to rewards that you will get one day for living the way you should, and for loving Him and serving Him. And so, like, as somebody who ultimately bows my knee to Jesus, I say, there is a place for thinking about rewards and letting that be part of my motivation. And I'm not talking about, material gain and blessing in this life. God's in control of whatever lot He gives me in that regard. But I know ultimately, like, the things that I do here on earth will contribute to an eternal reward. And you could even go into, will there be degrees of reward in heaven, and some getting more rewards than others? I tend to think so. But at the end of the day, it's all in God's hands, and nobody's going to be unhappy or envious in heaven. And we'll all know that everything God does is right, and all the ways He rewards different people for what they've done is right, and we'll love that and be joyful in that. So there's a lot you can get into there. I
used to tease you whenever you would lead a devotion for old people. You would always sing "I'll Fly Away" or songs about heaven. I'm like, dude, you think every one of them has to think about dying now?
They love it.
Well, but actually, I mean, and I like joking about it, but I really believe that all of us need to sing those songs more. Right?
That's right.
Like, the reality is, like, those promises aren't something like, hey, like, a few weeks before you die, start thinking about heaven. Like, live your entire life believing that I'm laying up for myself treasures in heaven, that moths and rust will destroy everything I'm doing here, but there is a treasure in heaven that's awaiting for me. And start right now putting that view of this future reward in front of you and live for that. And so as much as I tease you about it, the reality is you should have doubled down, and I think you did. I mean, we should double down on singing about heaven, on thinking about heaven, and letting this future reward, the belief that God is and that he rewards those who seek him should be the foundation of faith. And so his nature of reward is crucial. We don't call it karma, but it is the reality. It is a belief in a God who rewards obedience. And we don't want to throw it away.
Yeah.
All right, that was good.
I'm glad we went there and didn't skip
too.
it. So.
Me too. Hey, it's fun. I'm back up next week. I don't make any promises. My rough view is that we're going to do about half of 18 next week and then finish the other half. I want to get up to when Absalom dies, then talk about David's, the following week, talk about David's inability to deal with Absalom's death. And then one more week, possibly, to talk about David's mercy that he shows to those guys. And that's when it'll be 3 weeks from then, and that might be the week you preach, I believe. And you'll get to talk about your hero one more time, Mephibosheth, who is he's the man. He is awesome. So I don't promise that that's the schedule, but that's kind of the loose way it's in my head, and I'm excited to get back to
Looking forward to it regardless.
So. All right. See you guys.
See everybody at church.
That's right.
Be there.